Welcome and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm your host, Richard Restuccia, and today we're going to be talking about something that I think is really important to all of us, and at the same time, something I'm really personally interested in. So I get a double bonus today, and this is tree health, or how do we water our trees during a drought? And this becomes particularly important and particularly not as easy as normal, because all of a sudden we've got watering restrictions in a lot of areas, right? You can water your trees in certain parts of Los Angeles right now once a week, and they're trying to get you to water for just 10 minutes. I remember not too long ago in Texas, you could water once every 3 weeks. So trees are probably, well, not probably, are your most valuable asset on a property. And man, if you had to replace a 30-year tree, it's really impossible to do. And even if you could afford it, there's not that many 30-year-old trees that you could transplant. So keeping our trees healthy, the impact they have on our landscapes are so important. So keeping trees healthy during a drought is particularly important to all of us. So helping us along today is our guest. Now, our guest, I asked Andy Bellingary, one of my coworkers at Jane, who is an arborist. I said, who's the best arborist you know nationwide? And without hesitation, he said, Dennis Swartzell. And Dennis, and that was enough for me to hear that. And so I contacted Dennis, told him what we wanted to do. Dennis said he thought it was a great idea. Dennis is a graduate of the University of Georgia. He is a board-certified master arborist. He has been a park superintendent. He's been the landscape director for UNLV. He's a faculty member for the College of Southern Nevada. And he has a ton of years experience dealing with trees. And one thing I find is when dealing with arborists, especially board-certified master arborists, they really love what they do, and Dennis is no exception to this. So Dennis, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate that introduction.
Yeah, you bet. You earned it. So Dennis, let me just start right out of the gate here. And I wanted to ask you, how bad is this drought we're experiencing right now? How bad is it for trees in the urban areas?
Well, it's pretty bad. We're in the middle of a 20-year drought, and they don't foresee the end of this in the near future. So it could double that. Could be a 40-year drought, heaven forbid. And when you get into a situation like this, everybody wants to cut back on the amount of irrigation water. That's where the bulk of the water that is consumed by a community, the potable water, if you will, it mostly goes towards irrigation. So that's when they start pulling back the reins and putting the restrictions on. And we have our share of those around here.
Yeah. So it is a bad drought, right? And I'm glad you said 20 years. A lot of people are just saying a couple of years, but I think we had just a little bit of rain, a couple winters, and that was really it. It didn't mean that the drought was over. So right now, today, if I'm in a drought area, how concerned should I be about my trees?
Well, you could be very concerned depending on the species that you have. For example, here in our region, there was a great reliance on ash species for the tree canopy in many of the communities, and those trees aren't faring very well right now. If you have more water efficient plant material, trees that are from regions that are more arid, they're going to fare much better during those droughty conditions. But the way you manage the irrigation system is really going to have a huge impact on their welfare, especially during the summertime.
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? And this is where it gets tricky for a lot of people. Most people inherit an irrigation system, right? And we know that you should have your trees on a separate zone, then you have your grass or your turf, but a lot of trees are grown in turf. And we're watering our trees when we water our turf, and maybe now that's only once a week and for 10 minutes. So is this enough water for our trees?
Generally not. Tree roots, if they've been dependent on irrigation from turf, tend to be fairly shallow. So if the turf is suffering, your tree's probably suffering too. That's a really good indicator. If the grass is turned tan and it's not green any longer, your tree's having a tough time. So it needs a good deep soak periodically.
Yeah, so I like that tip, right? Your tree is probably stressed when your turf is stressed. But as I'm looking at my trees, because this is what bothers me, by the time I really figure out my tree doesn't have enough water, it might be too late. So what are some of those early warning signs I can look for that are telling me that my tree's stressed or not doing that well?
Well, there's a couple of things to look for. Obviously, if they're large leaved trees like an ash tree or maybe a sycamore, those leaves are going to wilt during the heat of the day. They'll recover as the temperatures go down in the evening, but that's your first sign is wilt. And then when you start to get branch tips dying, leaves being tossed off the tree, the tree can only hold so much biomass depending on how much water is in the system. So if the tree starts pitching leaves, that's a really good sign that you're not getting enough water in the system.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. So I'm just thinking myself right now, I've got a couple trees that are pitching a lot of leaves year round right now. And I know this because I'm picking them up. And I'm wondering if that is a bad sign for me. I'll have to go check that. I did want to remind everybody too who's watching, we have the Q&A and chat open as well today. So if you've got some questions for Dennis, please put them in there. We'll be happy to move those on to Dennis and get your questions answered. So the next question we have here, Dennis, is so we can see some wilting, tree loss, or tree leaf drop. We do allow for hand watering now in some of these instances. And so I'm wondering, what about hand watering? What are some of the best ways to hand water? And I think I do have some slides that you sent me that are going to depict that. So I'm going to pull those up while you talk.
Okay. Well, when you say hand watering, that's kind of deceptive. If you have your thumb on the end of the hose, I guess that could be called hand watering, but nobody wants to stand out there for any length of time trying to put water out manually like that. If the restrictions allow it, you could just set the hose down on trickle and allow it to run for 20, 30 minutes and then move it around. The idea is to give the trees a really good deep soak. And one of the ways to check that is with a long-handled screwdriver, perhaps a sharpshooter, where you can actually penetrate the soil and see if it's moist down to, say, 6, 10, or 12 inches. That's a pretty good guide depending on how the soil quality is. The sandier the soil, the deeper the water is going to penetrate into the soil. The more clay-like the soil is, it's going to spread and puddle. So you may be able to move that hose a little more frequently if you have a clay-like soil.
Yeah. Okay. Good tips. A couple questions have been generated as a result of this, right? So what about soaker hoses? Do you use a soaker hose at all? Is that helpful?
I think that's a better way of doing it because you can actually guide where that water goes with the soaker hose. They make these devices. We're talking about manual things here. So they like a little bulb with a whole bunch of holes in it that you can screw on the end of the hose. It's just a little soaker device. Those work, or if you use the soaker hoses like you've mentioned, you can actually get a bigger wetting pattern over a shorter period of time.
Yeah. So then we also hear a lot about putting a layer of mulch over our soil, right, to conserve water, to help with slow that evaporation. How does a 2 or 3 inch layer of mulch affect the health of a tree during a drought?
Well, actually, it's most beneficial. If you have a turf situation and you can take that turf away from the trunk, say 3 or 4 feet away from the trunk, and cover that soil with mulch. Now you've done a couple of things. You're going to retain more moisture. You're going to buffer the soil temperatures, so it's not spiking and dropping during the course of the day. I think that's a great way to go. The only caution is not to pile up that mulch on the trunk where we keep that bark wet all the time.
Yeah. So this is interesting because you and I were talking earlier this week. It's one of the fun parts of the job, right? Is to get to talk with you beforehand and learn some things. And you were talking about oxygen in the soil and how important that was and how that affects water. And wonder if you could just tell us a few things about that and maybe how we can improve oxygen in the soil.
Well, oxygen really dictates the depth of root systems for trees. Most urban soils are fairly compacted because of the nature of the building process. So root systems generally don't go very deep. They're 90% of the roots are going to be within 18 or 24 inches of the soil surface. So the depth of the water is really going to be a critical aspect, but the availability of oxygen to take the water and nutrients up is equally as important.
Yeah, so that's a good segue, right? So we often hear, you got to water your trees deep. But I think in most urban areas, and so when I think deep, I think many people think 5 or 6 feet. But I also think that trees in urban areas might only be 24 inches on their roots. So can you kind of clear this up for us and help us out here as what that means? You got to water them deep.
Well, sure. The root depth, again, is dictated by the availability of oxygen. The idea of watering deep really also embraces the concept of pushing excess salts out of the soil surface. In our area, we have a considerable amount of salt in our potable water. So when you water lightly, you're adding more salt with every irrigation cycle. So the idea is to push those salts down below the root zone if the percolation's there, so that we can minimize the impact of that salt. Many people don't realize that salts in contact with root systems actually has a reverse osmotic effect and pulls moisture out of the root system.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So so then is there a simple rule of thumb that we can use to say how much water we should be delivering to our trees?
Well, I don't know if there's ever a simple rule, but common sense would dictate that if it's a water efficient tree like a mesquite or a palo verde or a desert willow, then we want to make sure that we get a good deep soak, but we probably don't need to water as frequently as many of us do. They might need water every other day, every third day, every fifth day, depending on the soil type. So when people ask me, how much water should I apply? I frequently just say, I don't know, because I don't know what your soil type is. If I get a look at your soil, I can give a better answer. But if you know that your tree is an ash or a sycamore or something that is a heavy water user, then the depth of that application should be at least 12 inches deep and out to at least the drip line. I think if you use those common sense approaches about the placement of the wetting area and the depth of the wetting area, your tree is going to be pretty safe.
Yeah. So yeah, so interesting, right? It reminds me of a quote where there's a bunch of simple answers to complex problems that are wrong. Right. We always look for that simple, but I had read a rule of thumb somewhere many years ago about measure the size of the trunk diameter, and there's it equates to how many gallons or the canopy or something.
You know, I think there are some formulas that are out there, but again, the variables are too great to really use a formula like that. I think it just takes observation when you do your irrigation practice, whatever it may be, using the end of the hose or a temporary hookup with drip line, test that moisture level and see how deep it is. And if it's out to the edge of the drip line minimum, I think you'll be okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good rule of thumb, or a good recommendation. I also know I've used some online tools that use some ET calculations, as well as you put in your soil and information, and these help. And I think they're good. And then, of course, I have to say, where you can use a smart controller with Jane Unity software, and it'll measure it precisely, doing a calculation every hour, and your tree will get the proper amount of water. But I realize that's not a solution for everybody. So what about placing water bags around the tree? I see this a little bit, and we've got a question from that, where you place the bags, I guess you poke a few holes, or they have holes in them already, and they trickle out.
Yeah, those are porous systems that are stationary, and most of those systems have been developed for maintaining young trees that have yet to become established. And that's the critical factor for these young trees. If you don't have the labor or the time to go out there and hand water those periodically, then the commercially developed bag systems will provide that slow drip. I mean, you can do this with a 5-gallon bucket with a hole punched in it. I mean, it's not rocket science, but certainly those are great for young trees, not so much for established larger trees. They just need too much volume to be able to live on just those systems alone.
Right. So now you have an interesting way to hand water, right? I'm going to put a photo of a device that you've developed and you use, right? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, this is a system that we built about 40 years ago over at UNLV for deep watering larger big leaf trees like mulberries and ash and sycamores. This is made out of galvanized 3/4 inch pipe, and it's hard to see on here, but there's a ball valve on the right hand side of the T, and you use the water pressure to actually penetrate down into the soil. The shaft is 4 feet long, but you don't have to really get the full length of the shaft into the soil. The idea is that it's just easier than bending over or trying to get down on your knees to get this into the soil. So you use the water pressure to do all the work. It bubbles up and creates a hole that's about 4 inches in diameter. I generally try to point the probe away from the trunk in a downward angle, because we want our new roots that develop to grow out and away from the trunk rather than in towards the base of the tree. And then once the pressure has created that hole, you can turn the volume on the system down and just let it run on trickle. The benefit of this system are severalfold. You can flush excess salts out easily from the entire root zone and get it down below where they're not a problem any longer. And then the hole that you create can be used to fill with mulch material. We call it vertical mulching. And it's really beneficial to the tree because it retains moisture better than the native soil. And we find that the roots wrap around that hole that's been created. We've excavated trees years later after this type of setup and have found that we get these socks of roots developing around the placement of these deep watering probe holes. And then you can move this around during the initial irrigation cycle and then repeat in 3 or 4 weeks in a different placement. So you're creating even more vertical holes. It's just a great way to hand water.
Yeah. And so then this is a photo of you using one, right? And moving it around.
Yes, this is one of my colleagues here that's putting quite a bit of body pressure on the probe, but letting the water really do the work. And you can see it bubbles up out of there, and it's temporarily unsightly, but you can rapidly fill it back in. And you can leave them open if you want. That just allows for greater oxygen penetration into the soil.
Yeah. And so again, another great solution for watering trees in drought specialty situation. I mean, you can do this all the time too if you wanted, but especially when you're not getting, not having the ability to water as often as you'd like.
This is going to be hugely beneficial for those mesic trees that I mentioned, like fruitless mulberries, ash, sycamore, magnolia, all those trees that probably really don't belong in the desert, but wind up being here.
Right, right. Yeah, the transplants, the imports.
Right.
So yeah, and we were talking, and I was mentioning to you that I also do something similar to this, right? But I use drip irrigation, and this is a power lock fitting that we have that actually swivels onto a hose here. So from the you thread it onto a hose. You've got the power lock fitting, and then your drip tubing comes off of the power lock fitting, and you can actually wrap it around the tree. The key is to leave the ends, a spot in the ends, right? So you just put, so you don't make a complete circle, and that way you can wrap it and adjust. And I mean, here's a typical problem. Here's some olive trees that are being watered in the turf. And if you can't water the turf now, they're going to have to get some water somehow. And using this drip system is something that I've had some success with too. And here's the end with just the end flush valve that I put on the end, again, allowing you to wrap it around the tree and unwrap it. So
this is a great use of equipment there.
Yeah, so it's yeah, it's been it works, and it's not, you know, you're not dragging too many hoses around either. So Dennis, we've got another viewer asking about tree shock. What are some of the causes of tree shock?
I'm not quite sure where that question is leading to, but anytime there's a change in the environment, that's a potential shocking point. You know, we were talking about winds a little bit earlier. If you get a high wind for a couple of days, that can be really shocking to a tree. Excessive temperatures. We've been in the 1 teens for the last month or so, and that's really tough on plant material. Transplanting is another form of shock. Excessive pruning, where you open up the crown to a lot of sunlight. We find that to be a real problem here, where unscrupulous tree workers go in and do significant pruning, taking out lots of canopy just prior to the onset of the heat. And that can be really damaging to the upper branches, the trunk. And once you get sun damage, that's hard to recover from.
Yeah. So Dennis, if I'm looking at this tree now on the screen, and I'm thinking the roots extend to the tree canopy, but probably they extend way past that. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, we a little rule of thumb, take the height of the tree and then lay the tree down on its side and double it. And that's how far the roots go in one direction. And they could be further than that, depending on the species. So the minimum area that we want to irrigate is out to the edge of the drip line. But if we can go further, that would be better. That's really more for permanent irrigation. But if we're talking about emergency hand watering during restrictions and drought situations, stay out to the drip line at a minimum.
Yeah. So then, so that raises another question from one of our viewers, and that is, do I need to wet the entire area, or can I leave the wetting pattern in pinpoints?
Well, it'd be best to wet the entire area. Here's the other issue. If you're doing pinpoint watering, now you're pushing salt out to the edge of the wetting pattern, and you may be creating some really saline conditions right around the margin of the wetting pattern. And we see that a lot with irrigation systems that have been developed, drip irrigation, where the placement of the emitters is too far apart.
Yeah. Yeah. So even when, right, when you're doing this system that you've got on the screen right now, that water waters down vertically, but it also moves horizontally as well, right?
Absolutely. You're going to get a bell-shaped wetting pattern in most cases.
Yeah. And so as you move to the right or the left to do this again, you want to go to the edge of that bell shape.
Yes.
So, okay. So then this is an unfair question, Dennis, so I'm going to ask it anyway. It's from one of our viewers. That is, I have 5-gallon tree bags around my 2-year-old live oak trees, and I live in Texas. It's hot, and we're in a drought. How often should I fill those bags up?
If they're 2 years old, they're starting to enter establishment period. I would say at least once a week, but again, let's test that moisture level. It really is relative to the ET, as we've already discussed. So we may, depending on the size of the crown, how much foliage is in the tree, there may be a greater demand than what once a week watering can provide.
Yeah.
Test that moisture level.
Yeah. Okay. And again, I can dig a hole. I can use a screwdriver. I can use a soil probe. And these are how I test the moisture levels.
I use an auger. I use a hand-held auger with a 2-inch twist on it. It's the best tool I own. And
yeah,
I always ask gardeners, do you have a probe, a soil probe, or an auger? And if they say no, it's a red flag.
right. Right. Yeah. So yeah, definitely separates the quality, right?
Right.
So I know I see a lot of landscape that has heavy plantings underneath trees, maybe perennials or shrubs or even annuals. Is this helping, hurting the tree? What do you think about this?
Well, I never recommend the use of annuals under a tree because that's injurious to the root system of the tree every time you make a change in those annuals. I think that in some cases, the placement of shrubs can be helpful to act as a fairly tall mulch, if you will, a natural mulch. It also shades the trunk and keeps it a little cooler from the sun. So I think if the species selected are appropriate for use under the tree and the situation's compatible, then I think you're okay. If you get into a situation like in California with native oak trees, they do not like to have plant material underneath them in most cases. So I think it really depends on the nature of the plant.
Okay. That's good suggestions. Thank you. And then the one thing that we've got a question on, and then I wondered about too, is just in a drought with trees, should we be fertilizing at all?
Well, no. If a tree's stressed, why would you want to promote growth? That's even more stressful. To me, placing fertilizer on a stressed plant is like throwing gasoline on a fire. There's ample time to fertilize when the weather conditions are more conducive to the uptake of those nutrients. And remember, fertilizers are salts to begin with. So if you're adding more salt to the system, now you have a greater potential for burn. If you get a period of rainfall, you get a break in the drought that's temporary, that's your time to come in and use a fertilizer. And I personally prefer water-soluble fertilizers because the potential for burn is greatly diminished compared to granulars.
Yeah. Well, that's a great suggestion, great recommendation. Thank you. So somebody is asking Dennis about local native oaks during the summer. Is it a good idea to water those oaks if they're starting to see, or in this case, the canopy is quite sparse?
I think the oaks are going to be okay. If they're established, I don't think you need to worry about those too much. It's the non-natives that are the most prone to damage, but not the native oak trees.
Yeah. Okay. And then the tree watering bags again. Somebody wants to know, especially for young trees, are they going to be harmful for the young trees because these bags are going pretty close to the trunk?
I don't think so. I think that's a moot point.
Okay. Okay, great. Somebody's asking about the cost of this water system. Is that galvanized pipe, or does it have to be galvanized pipe? And is this expensive to put together?
Well, you could build one of these if you went down to one of the big box stores and picked up your pipe already threaded. This would probably run you about $35. If you had the ability to thread your own pipe and cut your pipe, you could probably build this for far less. But just as it's shown right there, that's about $35 worth of parts that are put together. You could do this with PVC. I mean, heck, when we were kids, we all drilled holes with a garden hose. We didn't need a pipe or anything. We just drilled a hole with the end of the hose. But in our area, we have a lot of rock in the soil. So the PVC is going to get chipped up or even broken trying to penetrate through that type of soil. But if you're in a good sandy loam soil like in Phoenix, I mean, you got 60 feet of soil before you get into rocky areas. You could do it with PVC quite easily.
Yeah, good to hear. And then, with the Jane system that I showed, this fitting's $2 fitting. The emitter line, is maybe 30 cents a foot, and this flush valve's less than $1. So you can do this very affordably as well. Do you have any resources, Dennis, that would actually show how to put that together if somebody was more of a learn by reading and doing?
Sure. I could send you a diagram on that. It's pretty simple.
Okay. Well, we're going to put in your contact information a little bit here when we're finished, and certainly somebody could reach out to you for that. So somebody else is writing that they've got a olive and eucalyptus tree very close to their house, within a couple feet of the outside wall. We hand water, but we're physically limited by the location of concrete, the driveway at the house, to be able to water the way you've described, right? Far out from the trees themselves. They're also getting a lot of concrete damage and pipe damage in the house too, due to the tree roots. We're in Southern California, and we're wondering if you can suggest tree replacements if we need to remove the ones we have.
So it was an olive and a eucalyptus?
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. It sounds like it was just inappropriate species selection for the site. But if it's a fairly confined area, which it sounds like it might be, if it's enclosed by a lot of concrete, maybe a smaller stature tree, something that's not going to get very large, or several small trees that could be appropriately placed in the site. It'd really be important to see the location visually before I made a strong recommendation. But look at things like desert willow, Chalopsis, Texas mountain laurel, which is Sephora. There's a lot of species out there that even large shrubs like Arizona rosewood can function as trees in what we call postage stamp landscapes. And it sounds like this might be the case where olive trees and eucalyptus, they're big dogs.
Yeah, no, those are good recommendations. I like that. And yeah, kind of tough with the roots. I think you'd want to stop that, especially if they're coming under the house.
Yeah, if you're having damage to the structure, then that's inappropriate species.
Right. Yeah. And then somebody else was asking about, moving the emitters away as the tree canopies grow. What do you think about that for an idea?
Well, yes and no. You want to maintain an even moisture level on the existing root ball that came with the tree when it was planted, but you do want to expand the irrigation as the tree grows. I was just looking at a property yesterday where all the emitters are still placed very close to the trunk of mostly mature trees, and those trees aren't growing. And if trees aren't growing, they're dying. So I think that the idea is not to move the emitters away from the trunk, but expand the irrigation out to at least the drip line at a minimum and beyond if at all possible.
Right. So you could just add a T fitting, for example, right here in the tubing and put another circle around the tree, and that'd be better than just moving the emitters out.
Absolutely. Don't move, just add two.
Yeah. So then, Dennis, somebody else is asking again, what is on the bottom of this pipe? Anything in particular? Anything special?
No, it's hard to, well, you can't see it in this photo because it's inserted in the ground, but the tip of the pipe has been crimped a little bit to make the opening more oval. And there's a little point on it. The end of the pipe is at a slight angle. And we did that just because of our Nevada rocks. They're numerous and big. So when you get into that situation, you can maneuver this unit around those rocks with that pointed end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And like you said earlier, the pressure of the water does most of the work.
Well, you want to do that. Otherwise, you're going to wear yourself out in short order.
That's right.
Especially when it's 110.
Yeah, I need to be spending less time in the sun doing physical work right now, right?
Exactly.
So, and then somebody else is asking about the recommended percent of crown thinning for large mature desert trees as not to cause damage due to hot or drought conditions. So how much should I be thinning?
That's a really good question. We call that dosage. So the dose of pruning should really be dictated about what's your goal. If you're pruning to thin the tree because you're worried about it blowing over, I think you could easily take 20% out of the tree. If you're pruning for aesthetics, maybe it's far less. I think it really is dependent on what your ultimate goal is. And I tell people all the time, don't prune for the sake of pruning, because Bob down the street's pruning his tree. I got to prune mine. You should have an ultimate goal in mind as to whether it's aesthetics, wind velocity, density of the foliage, how much sunlight you need below the canopy. There's a lot of reasons to prune trees.
That's a really good point. A lot of people, maybe they think, hey, I should just prune it because it needs to be pruned every year, right? Or every couple of years.
Trees have been living for a long time without any assistance from us. And many times less is more.
Yeah, good point. So somebody else is asking about the auger you described. Where can somebody get one of these? What do they cost, right, for your soil sampling?
Well, the one I own is about 30 years old, so they don't make it anymore. It's a really heavy duty auger. They ran about $200, but they just don't make them anymore. But I did find a client of mine notified me that they had found one on Amazon that's made out of stainless steel. It's not a 2-inch diameter, but it's a 1-inch diameter. I have one of those and I like it. It's just that it's got a tip on it like a ship's auger, which will go right through pipe and wire.
Yeah.
So I'm really cautious about where I use it because I don't like fixing irrigation systems that I've broken.
Yeah, and I think I found an auger too a few years ago on Amazon. It only goes to 15 inches, but it wasn't very expensive.
Well, this one's a good 3.5 feet long. It's a little pricey. It was over $100, but it's well made.
Yeah, yeah, and right, it'll be a one-time investment.
Absolutely. If you don't leave it somewhere, it's going to be with you for a lifetime.
Yeah. So, final question here for the day, Dennis. You've been really generous with your time. I really appreciate that. This gentleman has a 60-foot pecan tree with roots on one side under concrete, and the other side is in clear sandy soil. Any suggestions on how to set up irrigation for that?
Well, obviously, you can't get irrigation under the concrete, nor would you want to, because then you're going to promote root growth underneath the concrete. And as roots grow, they get bigger in diameter. So that gives you that upward pressure that causes concrete damage. So I would concentrate all of the irrigation in the non-concrete side, put it down in a uniform pattern, and if at all possible, mulch the area so that you retain more moisture. You're going to get the majority of your root system development in that area and not under the concrete.
Yeah. Yeah, great suggestions. And gosh, Dennis, we've had, I don't know, 27 questions or so today. They've been rapid fire. This has been a super interesting subject, and you have delivered some really good answers as well as some good practical advice that we can use every day. I mean, that's about as much as we can expect. So,
well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
yeah, but as you know, people are always going to have questions after, oh, I wish I would have asked this. I wonder about this. I put your contact information up there. Okay for people to reach out and contact you if they want to know something about additional about irrigating trees during the drought.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Be patient with me. Sometimes I get pretty busy. So give me a little bit of time to get back to you, and I'll be happy to help you if I can.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. Again, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who tuned in today. We know with the amount of people who signed up, trees in the drought is really important. So we'll hopefully have Dennis back here in a few months, and we can talk about what to do about your trees as we head into winter. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. As you know, you can view all of our 200+ trainings on the Janes USA website /trainings. Or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. You know, Dennis, we've got people out working every day, listening to our podcast, learning about conservation, sustainability, and water management. It gets me really excited about what we're doing today. So again. Thanks to all our viewers. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next week.
Take good care of your trees.